thank you very much indeed to everyone in Barcelona who has made it possible for me to come, the Association of Universities, and for Kasia as well for hosting me here. It's always, well, not always, a great pleasure to come to Barcelona because I'm an Arsenal fan, so sometimes it's very painful to come to Barcelona. But usually when I'm not involved with football, it's pleasurable to come to Barcelona. I am actually going to talk about Trump and Brexit. I'm not going to talk about Erdogan and Putin, not directly, but I am going to talk about Trump and Brexit. And I am going to reflect, I suppose, on where we are at the end of a kind of extraordinary and interesting and alarming year, and what it means for cities. And what it means, particularly, I suppose, in a place like Barcelona. And I suppose my big thought is that what Barcelona now does matters more than ever. Because Barcelona has been, over many years, such an incredible source of new ideas, new thinking, culture, architecture, art, and thinking about how to live in a city well, that I come to Barcelona because I kind of feel it's a kind of form of education to come here, to continue to learn about what it means to live well in a city. And now more than ever, we need places, sources of energy, ideas, creativity about how to live well together. So what Barcelona now does and the kind of models it can provide are really, really important, not just for Barcelona, but for many other places. So I think the question that many of us are asking is, what now? I suppose the answer to that is, well, Christmas is what now? And I imagine everyone is very relieved that there's going to be Christmas. But in a deeper sense, what now? So this is the British government's strategy for what now. This is their Brexit strategy. The British government has been criticised for not having a strategy for Brexit, but this is it. And that is kind of one approach to the modern world. But I think that this, in a way, is the big question. Is where will, out of all this mayhem, where will shared stories of hope come from? What will be the sources of those? And I think cities will be a really important part of where that renewal, which I am sure will come, because I think there are very powerful sources of imagination and hope at work. Cities are a really important part of that. And I suppose the question or the thought that I want to leave you with at the end is to think of the city as a kind of innovation commons. I think the idea of the commons is quite important to the current administration in Barcelona. And I think it's important more generally. But this idea that cities are, in a sense, common spaces where we innovate new ways to live, that is the most important sense of what a city should be now. It should be a kind of common space for innovation. And it should be one that brings together many different players, cities, administration, companies, social actors, in creating new and better ways to live. So if we could reimagine the city through this idea of the innovation commons, which is something I'm working on in London to create a kind of place that this would be embodied in, that I think is where we're headed. So this is where one place I would start. Everyone knows what this is, right? This is a London taxi. And for many, many years, these London taxis were the only way you could really get around London by taxi. And the drivers of these are absolutely central to the knowledge economy, because they spend 4 or 5 years learning every route and every road in London So they are independent knowledge workers, taxi drivers. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, comes Uber. And suddenly, anyone with a car and a phone can become a taxi. And these people, having built up this knowledge and position and a whole narrative about their lives built on knowledge, suddenly find themselves disrupted. And by the way, of course, Uber is many different things. It's both a Silicon Valley funded, venture capital funded digital company, but in some respects it's also a first job for lots of people coming to the city. It's an opportunity to make a living. It's many different things. So now if you go in a taxi, this is basically a journey in an existential crisis, because the entire life plan of this taxi driver and their family is now being shaken and threatened and made uncertain. And the ripples of that kind of spread out. So this is not, however, from the point of view of the city, just a question, difficult question, of regulating Uber, freeing up taxis, or so on and so forth, because actually what this really is a question about how we move around a city in future and what the different options are. And actually, if you look at cities worldwide, what you see is an enormous growth in cycling, quite a lot of investment in light rail and trams, increasing investment in rapid buses. Actually, the most important way we should get around cities is walking, because walkable cities are the most creative, sociable, livable places. And beyond that, you see all forms of driverless cars and car sharing and so on and so forth. So the big question for cities is not just Uber versus taxis. The big question is, how should we move together in future? And right at the heart of that, of course, is what's the future of the car? Because the car, that combustion engine choking the air, sitting stationary, unused, is one of the sort of big problem areas for all cities, it seems to me. Cities built around cars, are they in effect built around redundant pieces of equipment? Well, that's quite a big conclusion to come to if you're a car maker like Seat or Volkswagen. And so this whole question of how we move is one that's going to affect all sorts of people in all sorts of ways, and a creative city will have a way of addressing it. And what I'm just trying to say there is that when you get into a taxi, you are getting into a big question. Everyday life is now involved in these much bigger questions. Let me give you another example. Do you have these in Barcelona? They're self-service checkout tills at supermarkets, where you go to a supermarket. So I come off the tube, the underground at my station, Highbury, and I go to the local supermarket, which is right next to the station, Waitrose, and I get my shopping, and I stand in a line. And I think, am I going to go to the person over there who will take my shopping and scan it and then put it in a bag and I pay them? Or do I go to one of these machines where I scan it and then I pay? And I think to myself, I'm really grown up. I've got a degree. I'm extremely capable. I am going to go to the self-service till to show that I can scan my own shopping. And I'm deeply, deeply competitive. So I want to do this as quickly as possible and quicker than the other people scanning their shopping. And so I go to the till and you go bleep and then it goes wrong and then the manager has to come and help you. And then all the people behind you in the queue think, what is that old guy doing trying to scan his shopping? And why hasn't he got someone helping him? And then eventually, after you've done it a few times, you get the hang of it. And you get this very satisfying bleep. You take the item, you scan it, it goes bleep, and then you put it in your bag. And then after a little while, you get good enough at it that you can do an entire bag of shopping like this. And at the end of this, when I've done an entire bag of shopping, I pick up the bag, I think, yes, I've done an entire bag. And so then I look at the person whose job it is to do this, and I think this must be very odd for her, because she must think that we're doing her out of her job. Because we are now, the shoppers, are now doing the scanning. And I think it's really odd that Waitrose have persuaded me to become a shop assistant, basically. They've persuaded me to spend maybe 5 minutes of my day being a shop assistant. And I think that's a good thing. I think, wow, I've achieved something. I've been a shop assistant. So then the challenge is, coming soon, Amazon. You'll walk into an Amazon store with your phone. It will know who you are. You will pick up some items from things with RFID tabs. It will automatically charge your phone. You'll walk out of the shop. That will happen, I would think, within the next 3 to 5 years. So then you think, well, what will happen to these people then who are at the tills doing this? And part of me thinks this is ridiculous. Why would we not want to do that? And then part of me thinks the idea of a human being standing all day going like this is not a job for a human. This is a job that should be done by machines. And actually what the humans should be doing is something human, which is social, creative, empathetic, conversational. But I'm not sure who's going to pay them to do that. But what I do think is that the answer is not to defend the idea of humans scanning things like this, because humans scanning things like this, that isn't really a human job. It shouldn't be a human job. But this is going to be one of the dilemmas. And so in a city like Barcelona, where hundreds of thousands of people are employed in retail in one form or another, this is going to be a big issue. It's going to be a big issue for any city. And again, what it means is that when you go into a shop and you do this, you're involved in a big question. And if you don't think that that is important and it's not coming, let me just read you this quote that I read last night as I was having dinner and I was reading something on my phone. This is someone talking about automated customer service systems. They're always polite. They always upsell. They sell you more. They never take a vacation. They never show up late. There's never a slip or a fall, nor an age or sex or race discrimination case. That is a quote from Andrew Puzder. Andrew Puzder is the CEO of Hardee's and another fast food chain in America, and he's just been made Labour Secretary in the Trump administration in America. And he's responsible for regulations which cover 125 million workers. So this sense that these questions about work, the city, how we live together, they're big, and they're coming, and they're difficult, and really good cities will find creative ways to address them. So I think, in a way, existential crisis, this sense of uncertainty, is now a sort of new normal. This questioning of established ways of doing things, and this very profound and unsettling sense that nothing can be fully trusted anymore. So we can't, it seems, trust news that we get on Facebook. We can't necessarily trust, I think, the rule of law anymore in a world of Erdogan and Putin and of what's happening in Eastern Europe and so on and so forth. There are plenty of people who seem to think that democracy is no longer the best way to run things. And so there are lots of things that we once might have relied upon. Freedom of speech. It's increasingly difficult for many people to enjoy freedom of speech in a world in which internet trolling and other things can lead to real threats of violence. And the fundamental thing, I think, about what's happened this year for me is that the status quo no longer works. What people are telling us is the status quo is not working. So if you think about Brexit for a moment, which of course I've had to think a lot about. So Brexit basically is a decision by an entire country to engage in what's likely to be a decade-long experiment involving 60 million people where no one is in charge, basically, and where we take every rule of the game possible and just throw it up in the air without knowing where it's headed. And so if that is what is happening, you have to say, well, okay, so some of the people who voted for Brexit might be mad, some might be racist, some might be deeply xenophobic, but let's assume that quite a lot of them aren't. Let's assume that they're rational. Why would people vote for something so uncertain? Well, it's because probably what is certain is less attractive than this deeply unappealing prospect. And so what is less attractive is the certainty that your life is in some sort of defeated dead end, that actually there's no prospect of progress because your income is not going to go up, your opportunities are not going to expand, the place you live is not going to get better. So the reason I think that one reason that quite a lot of people voted for Brexit is this sense that the status quo is not working and it's not responsive. It's not responding to their voice, their need, and given an opportunity, they take this opportunity to kind of lash out and break it up. And the status quo doesn't work for the three players crucially involved in this platform. It doesn't work for cities, it's not working for universities, I think, and it's not working for companies. And cities, universities, and companies are all deeply implicated in what is going on at the moment. So if you think about cities, cities have had this fantastic run. After a period in the 60s and 70s when cities all over the world were contracting, especially in the developed world as people moved out to the suburbs, since the mid-90s, cities have started growing again. And actually much of this renaissance starts, one place it starts is in Barcelona and Bilbao, the creative city, the revalorization of the inner city no longer a place that people are scared of, but they want to come back to, so on and so forth. And one place you see this, oddly, is in the renaissance of US cities, second-tier US cities, Philadelphia, Miami, Detroit even, sort of people coming back to the city. And so cities are absolutely vital to cosmopolitan open values. I mean, look at the voting record in the States. The larger and more diverse the city, the less likely to vote for Trump. But what's happening is two other things, is that cities are increasingly at odds then with nations and regions, because so much power and wealth is concentrated in cities that there's a growing inequality between the city and the province. You see this incredibly clearly in the United States, where cities like Charlotte in North Carolina or Philadelphia in Pennsylvania are really oddly related to the rest of the state, which seems provincial, rural, and backward, economically backward in many senses. But also cities are becoming more unequal within themselves. They're becoming more segregated. There's less room for the middle. They are increasingly places of rich and poor, but not really for the middle in many ways. And so, in many ways, the vote in Brexit was a revolt against London. It was a revolt against the power of London, its elitism, the fact that it seemed to live in a separate world. So cities have a lot at stake in this debate. Secondly, companies have a lot of at stake in this debate because people are responding to the growth of inequality, and they are questioning what companies are for, whether companies are simply there for shareholders or whether they're there, as Jordi Portabella talked about earlier, they're there for a wider kind of agenda, about social growth, about social improvement and progress. And finally, there's an implication for universities, because much of this vote was a vote, both in Brexit and in Trump, was a vote where there was a big difference between the more and the less educated. With the more educated tending to vote against Brexit and for Clinton, and the less educated for Trump and for Brexit. And there is an implication there, which is, well, these are, I think, people who feel they are often failed by the education system. They're set up to fail, and they feel that opportunity is denied them in some sense. And that universities, I think, are caught in a world where they are sort of churning people out with degrees, but not really clear what they're educating for. More and more universities that I work with seem to be in the process of churning out more undergraduates, but less sure what they're churning them out for. And the undergraduates are less sure about what the qualifications are worth in the labour market, where they may well go straight into unemployment. So Korea, South Korea, 600,000 people graduate from university, 550,000 of them don't get a job. Well, that's a lot of effort to go to not get a job. So there's a big question here for universities as well. So I just want to talk about what I see as 6 responses to this kind of sense of existential crisis. They are responses which will affect cities, companies, individuals, and they will affect the sort of culture that we inhabit and the way that we talk about things. And you can see them rippling through society and maybe even within ourselves. And they're not exclusive. They often can combine and get mixed up. So the first response, I think, to this sense of existential crisis is a sense of escape. People want to escape. They want to get away from it. They want to pretend it doesn't exist. So this is Downton Abbey. We are, I don't know if you know Downton Abbey, but Downton Abbey is one of a whole series of British nostalgic kind of products which we now kind of bathe ourselves in. There's a new Netflix series called The Crown, which has 100 episodes. That is probably 10 years worth of nostalgia ahead of us. And so this sort of sense that we can escape into nostalgia is a very strong thing. If you look at Trump's economic program, it's basically nostalgia. It's nostalgia for industries that America has lost. And so it's an attempt to recreate mid-century economic values in America. But, you know, you go into any bookshop, you'll find it full of mindfulness books. Mindfulness is a sort of form of escape. It's a huge business. It's a huge industry. And the implication is, well, actually, if the world out there is awful, then retreat into yourself. And you could see that reflected in cities as well. This is escapism. So I think what football is selling, basically, is escape. It's a form of escape into some sort of primordial identity that you can kind of escape into for, at least a period each day if you're a football fan. And it creates a kind of moment of kind of shared experience, which is very emotional but fleeting in some sense. So I would say there are going to be a lot of escape industries, basically. There's going to be a big market in escapism. And I think the city will be a part of that the city will be seen as a form of spectacle or a way to escape or a way to enjoy yourselves or so on and so forth. And this is going to be an important part of what cities do and how they're regarded. The second response is anger. So people get angry with the disappointment, the upset, the sense of loss, betrayal. Language becomes very charged, and people look for things to be angry about. And actually, one of the things that I think is happening is that people are just looking to be angry in more ways. And anger is spreading as a kind of social response. So, of course, this is anger. This is the kind of channeling of anger and both the provocation of it. And I think, in many ways deeply worrying because anger begets anger. So this, I don't know if you remember this, I'm surprised there hasn't been more anger of this kind. This was these executives from Air France being attacked by strikers. I'm kind of surprised there hasn't been more anger of this kind. Because I think probably they're, in a way, one would expect it. This is the Brexit vote celebrated by pro-Brexit supporters. There's a sort of connection here in some sense about a sense of anger at the status quo against elites and so on and so forth, and the sort of cathartic experience of anger. And this was a riot in London in 2011, just before the Olympics. And again, sort of thinly below the surface. And if we think all of that is kind of, well, maybe not there. I mean, this is Baltimore. And this is Baltimore under Obama. And it just about kept the lid on it. All we've got to do is think through what's happened in US cities over the last 4 years and just imagine that happening over the next 4 years and where it might lead. And it's not pretty. So I think this sort of sense of anger, and I'm afraid to say as a great advocate of the power of digital media to create collaborative solutions and so on and so forth, one of the alarming things is the translation from online echo chambers of trolling and anger and kind of mobbing into the real world. And I'm also worried, very worried, that you see that. So the other day, a guy turned up at a bookstore in Washington with a gun because he'd read on Facebook that it was the center of a Clinton-inspired child sex ring. And, it sounds ridiculous, but in a way, that's an alarming part of where we might be headed. And so that affects cities because cities are where rich, educated people live. And one of my worries would be that cities become the objects of that kind of anger. The third thing that you see is a desire for control. Of course, the Brexit vote, the rallying cry of Brexit was take back control. And it spoke very directly to this sense that life is out of control, so take back control. Of course, it's a complete illusion, but that is what the rallying cry was. And so one of the things you see is people offering, and we will see more offers from more people to say, I will get this under control. And that is part of the appeal of Erdogan and Putin and strong leaders. I will get this under control. I can sort this out. Just give me the power to do so. And in order for us to feel more control, we may feel the desire to cede that to other people. So you'll see more gates, more walls, more barriers, more fences. And in cities, you may see more gated communities. I don't know, perhaps. But this is one option. I also tend to think that the whole offer of big data by big companies is an offer of control. If we just had all the information about all of what's going on, we would be able to get it under control. In big data, there is a sort of offer that the world is completely knowable and we could control it for you, we, IBM or Cisco or what have you. So it's playing to this desire for control. And then there's also the lifestyle of control. So I don't know if anyone's read this book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. This is all about control. Again, what it's saying is, actually, if you were more controlled, if you had more self-control, then the world would be a saner place because you would be able to control your desires and so on and so forth. And what you've got to imagine is you read that book and then think about a city. Imagine a decluttered, tidied up city. And what you would get would be something, I don't know, maybe a bit like Dubai or somewhere like that. But it wouldn't be very attractive, in my view, because it would be extremely controlled, very tidy, almost like a Potemkin village. Everything would be in its place, but it would be controlled. So I think this is one tendency, this decluttered, tidy, surveilled city, which is, as a result, feels safe. So escape, anger, control, all of those might, in some sense, work together. You could escape into anger. You could, anger could lead to a desire for control. The fourth thing that I think you see a lot of, which I think has really positive aspects to it, all of these things could potentially have positive aspects, is you see a lot of coping. That is mainly, I think, what people are doing. They're mainly coping. They're mainly kind of getting by and making do and helping one another and getting through. And so this has become a kind of existential slogan worldwide and created by the British during the Second World War. What it says is there are very, very good reasons to panic, but don't. Just keep calm and carry on. And so there is an awful lot of just let's carry on going on. And if we just carry on for long enough, then maybe we'll get back to some state of normality. So this is a very strong tendency. If we just all keep calm and carry on, then maybe we'll sort of find our way through all of this. So after those 2011 riots in London, there was a kind of huge explosion of this, of cleaning up and coping and getting together. The most impressive, in many ways, city for keeping calm and carrying on is Athens. I mean, Athens, in the midst of political meltdown, economic austerity, has a migration influx. And one of the most important responses of the city is this kind of shared coping of a sort of civic action of people coming together and of doing this kind of thing. This is an open-air kitchen. And in a strange kind of way, the gig economy, although the jobs that the gig economy creates are pretty marginal, the gig economy for lots of young people is part of coping. Because if they can piece together 2 or 3 jobs, then they've got a bit of an income which can kind of sustain themselves and so on and so forth. So the whole gig economy, this is a thing called Deliveroo. Have you got Deliveroo yet? You've got Deliveroo. So my nephew who's an English literature graduate, he's super bright, he was always top of his class, comes out of university, wants to be a musician, he's living in the East End of London, he becomes a Deliveroo driver, cyclist, because all you need is a bike and a mobile phone, and then they give you one of those bags, and then you go and collect food from restaurants and take it to people who want it. And it's good for the restaurants because they get a way of delivering food, and it's good for the people because they get food that they want, and he gets a bit of a job, and so on and so forth. He is the Deliveroo cyclist for where we live. And so when he's not working, he comes and sits in our house. So he came the other day, he was doing his lunchtime shift, it was 2.5 hours, and I said, so how much do you earn for 2.5 hours? And he said, well, if I get a good shift, I will deliver 5 meals, and I'll probably get paid about £18. So it's just above the living wage. So I said, so what do you do then at the end of your shift? He said, well, I'm usually at the end of my shift, I'm very tired because I've been cycling, and it's lunchtime, and I haven't had lunch, so I go home. And I said, what do you do then? He said, then I order a Deliveroo. So he basically earns enough money to order a Deliveroo. I think he's got about £3 left over. I sort of think, God, is this the future? And he's sort of making things work at the moment, but it's not very easy, and it's certainly not the basis for long-term investment or creating a family or anything like that. So there is a limit to coping. She is coper-in-chief, in my view. She is coping when everyone else is falling to bits. She is kind of, politics is imperfect, but we'll find a way through. And what's happening with this coping stuff is that it's all going to become much more, in a way, it could become much more systematic. So this is just one of many slides about resilience that you can find on the internet. And the promotion of resilience as a virtue for individuals, for companies, for cities, is a reflection of the fact that the world is deeply uncertain and constantly changing, and you have to become more resilient. Don't make the world less uncertain, make the people more resilient. And so you see this Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, all about resilience, one of the international bestseller. It's all about promoting resilience. And so what we'll find in education systems is the promotion of resilience and grit as a virtue to cope with a more uncertain world. And what we'll also find, I suspect, is this, hypernormalization. Hypernormalization is a term created by this guy, Alexei Yurchak, in a book about the last decade of the Soviet Union, and taken up now in a very passionate film by the filmmaker Adam Curtis. And what hypernormalization means is that in a world that is collapsing around you, the Soviet Union is collapsing, what did people do? They became hypernormal, which meant that they coped in a hyper kind of way. Let's just stick absolutely to what we're doing and do it better and better and be normal better and better to avoid the fact that the world is collapsing around us. And there is a way that coping could become that, and you could get hypernormalization. I was in a thing 2 days ago in Copenhagen with a very senior person from the European Commission who basically said, sort of in kind of almost, didn't quite say this, but basically said, we're facing the rise of a new form of fascism in Europe. And a guy from McKinsey who basically said, we must stick to our key performance indicators. And this kind of contrast between we're facing the rise of fascism, stick to your key performance indicators. And he had a point, which was actually if government were better at delivering what it's supposed to deliver, people would be less dissatisfied. But in a way, I feel I am constantly in a lot of discussions where there are people sort of carrying on as normal whilst the world is falling to bits. And I just don't think that's going to add up in the end, that there is a limit to coping. There are people, of course, who would welcome all of this, who think that actually crisis is precisely what we need, and that the more urgent, the more threatening the crisis, the better, because it will unlock a kind of cathartic response. And these come in many different forms. And it's not unusual, I think, in times of crisis that you get this kind of thinking. But these guys, I think, are that. I think part of the problem with Silicon Valley is that they are in the sort of cathartic crisis business. Because if everything was disrupted by everything else and everyone was disrupting everyone else, then the economy would somehow become this sort of huge engine of creativity. And I'm not saying they are completely like these guys, but these guys are also in existential crisis. They are end of days, and so are these guys. These are end of days for industries. These are end of days for Western civilization. But there is something that's, I mean, I'm constantly, in my mind, why are we living in a world where on the one hand we've got DeepMind, the Google artificial intelligence system, and we've got these guys? Why is it that our lives are sort of bookended by these two things? And I think it's something to do with this kind of common theme. So the final place, and where I think we need to be, is we need creative responses. And we need creative responses which simply get back to the idea of helping people to lead better lives and to show that the economy, that the political system, that social systems can actually start responding to what they really need. And that the most important responses are going to be creative responses, and they're going to be responses which are going to have to change the rules of the game. So I think quite a lot of the time, my time certainly advising in politics, what we've been trying to do is say to people, we can allow you, encourage you to play the game better. We can train you, we can equip you, we can invest in you, so on and so forth. Here is this game, globalization. We will train you to play that game better. And actually what you want is, can we create a better game? And what I think Barcelona needs to do is create a better game. Not just play the game better, create a different game, new rules of the game. That's what people are asking for. They want new rules of the game. And I think that often when entrepreneurs are reshaping markets, what they're doing is often changing the rules of the game, which allows new kinds of relationships to emerge, which allow resources to move in new ways, and out of it you get new solutions. So when Uber comes along, they say there's a new rule of the game. Someone with a mobile phone and a car becomes a taxi. That creates new resources, because suddenly anyone with a car can become a taxi driver, and that creates new relationships, because instead of hailing a taxi like that, you're doing it like this in a new kind of way. So when entrepreneurs, I think, are remaking markets, this is what they're doing. And when Barcelona City says to Airbnb, actually, you can't do that to our city, what Barcelona is in effect having to say is, we need new rules of the game. We're not just, I think, sticking by the old rules, how can we create new rules? And new rules which are better for the city and better for lots of people. So here are 3 areas where I think you should attend to. The first is about economics. The work that I've done in Britain, in Canada and elsewhere, Canada, I'm doing quite a lot of work in Canada. It's one of the great hopes of the world, Canada, now. But I've done a project in Canada looking at what ordinary Canadians want from the economy and how you could reorganize the flows of the economy to meet their needs. And having worked with 20 entrepreneurs to interview hundreds of people about this, the conclusion that we came to is that people want money with meaning. And what I mean by that is they want more money and they want lower cost services, but what they really want is more meaning in their lives. They want narrative, they want relationships, they want belonging, they want a place to call home. And actually this is it's not just about money, it's not just about growth or jobs or incomes or taxes, it's about whether they feel that their lives are amounting to something and whether it has a sort of narrative that they can see into the future. And so I think that that does imply an economy which is more humane, more relational, which takes care and families seriously, which takes seriously the social dimensions of the economy. If I were Barcelona, what I would do with this platform, with universities, companies, the city, is that I would create a commission or a platform about the future of work in Barcelona and how for Barcelona to become a place where the value of human work is absolutely essential to the city, and that technology and other things were organized around that central goal, that this is a human city in which people do human work of value, and that's the future of the city in creating that. That is a huge challenge for every one of those players, the city, the university, and for companies. And it's a shared challenge, and there are all sorts of ways in which you could address that. Basic income is one that's being experimented with in Finland, of course, but there are implications for the education system, there are implications for entrepreneurship and self-employment, there are implications for the responsibilities of companies, so on and so forth. But this is a big debate which everyone could and needs to be involved in. On the social and cultural side, I think that people are desperate for a sense of belonging, desperate for a sense of home, for a place called home, and also for inclusion. So one of the big challenges in cities is that we have worked out, I think, how cities can grow, but most growth in most cities comes at the price of inequality. And actually, if you want to grow but not become more unequal, then I think that's a really interesting agenda. Fair growth in cities, how would you organize that? And again, what I would suggest there is that there are all sorts of ways that you could in Barcelona create platforms for civic innovation and for social innovation at scale in districts, where you could bring together ways basically to make life better for people on average earnings. That should be the goal. I would target people, families especially, on average household earnings and work out how could we create a better life for these people. And that means cheaper utilities, cheaper energy, better transport, better places to live, better schools, better public spaces, and take areas where you've got 10,000 households and work with that as a kind of social improvement and investment district where you could bring together different players to work out how to live better. The place that I know, one of the places that I know that I think has done that is Freiburg in Germany. And Freiburg in Vauban, which is a new area of development, the public sector's played an absolutely critical role in providing much of the land and infrastructure, but they've then allowed a mass of private development within rules with lots of home ownership and self-building involved in it, to create communities where the most energy efficient apartment in Vauban costs 50 euros a year to heat. 50 euros a year. Now that is really useful innovation. If you can say to a family on average earnings, we are going to make your energy bill 50 euros a year so that you will have more to spend and kind of contribute to the other things that you want to do, that's significant. So I think innovating around the basics of housing, families, energy, transport, this is absolutely essential. In London, the biggest problem, London is hugely rich, very successful, incredibly dynamic, but it's punishing for people in the low end of the labour market and extremely expensive, and the housing market has not responded to growth. But the other thing is that it's really difficult for families. So childcare in London is like a second mortgage. It's like having a second house. So that really limits women's opportunity for employment, which then really limits household incomes. And so this whole family childcare market, completely disorganized and kind of structured, needs innovation. Why isn't there something as radical and creative as Uber or Deliveroo or Airbnb for childcare? And it wouldn't be like that, of course. But what I'm saying is that we need to focus social innovation on really fundamental, basic kind of things for families and cities. And I think that one of the real opportunities for Barcelona is to recast cosmopolitanism, because what I think people are reacting against is this idea that cosmopolitan values mean that you're unrooted, that you come from nowhere, that you belong to the global world and you don't belong to anywhere. And I think what you see in Barcelona is a place which is deeply rooted in its own culture and yet completely cosmopolitan in its access to the world. And that combination, that you can be rooted and belong and come from somewhere and yet, as a result, be completely open to the world, that is the kind of recipe that we're going to need for the future. So more inclusive, fairer cities, but also this rooted cosmopolitanism. And by the way, the work that I have done on looking at innovators in the developing world, particularly kind of frugal innovators who come up with really radical and new ideas for housing and childcare and finance and stuff like that, is that they are rooted cosmopolitans. So they're often people who come and take ideas from the US and Europe and universities and then come back to India or Africa and do new things in that place with those ideas. And this sense of a place being open to the world but bringing them home to a particular place is very important. And finally, I think we need to embrace the idea that democracy should be tumultuous. I think democracy has become too procedural, too technocratic, too managerial. And there is something about what's happened in the last year which is tumultuous. And rather turning our back on all of that, we've got to somehow embrace that. And I think that what would it be for Barcelona to be the cradle of 21st century democracy? So for Barcelona, like Athens all those centuries ago, to somehow invent a new way of doing democracy. And I think that at the core of that is that modern democracy in cities is increasingly a contract between citizens, not between citizens and the state. The most important social contract in cities is how citizens govern one another and how they're helped to govern one another, not what their relationship is with the state. The relationship with the state can help enable this lateral relationship, but this is going to become more and more and more important. And that, I think, is a huge opportunity for Barcelona to explore that. So I would just urge you to think of this idea of Barcelona as a kind of innovation commons, as a place where people can come together to mix and create new ideas. And this is an idea that, as I say, I'm trying to kind of do something with in London. London has 22 commons, Ealing Common, Clapham Common. It has 22 physical spaces which are still called commons. And the commons is both a very modern and a very old idea. The House of Commons, common law, the pulp song, common people. So it's got a kind of resonance, the idea of the commons. But I think it needs to be allied to this sense of creativity and innovation and possibility rather than defensiveness. And in Britain, in England in particular, it's very English. The commons has there's two different sorts of meanings. One is the commons as a shared resource, which is under shared ownership and shared management. And the other is more of the commons as something which is stewarded by enlightened private owners who work with communities to give them rights to use common resources in particular ways. So the absolutely ancient English idea of the commons is that the Lord is the steward of the commons, but he would grant to these people the right to graze their pigs and to these people the right to collect walnuts and so on and so forth. So there are different ways in which commons can work with different levels of public, hybrid and private ownership. And I think that experiment is one that's worth engaging in. I do think that there is something very powerful potentially about this idea if you can mobilize it. So you could imagine this, that the new rules of the game are being created out of this innovation commons, and that creates these new relationships so you can address these shared challenges about mobility, housing, energy, work, so on and so forth. And so to see the city as a kind of unfolding, shared experiment in living well together, that is what cities are, it seems to me. And I think Barcelona remains one of the most important, impressive and interesting places in the world where that experiment can take place. And that's both a huge opportunity and, I have to say, a bit of a responsibility, because there are lots of people looking to Barcelona now for these new ways of thinking. I'll just leave you with this thought, this contrast, because this is another existentialist. This is Sitting Bull. And Sitting Bull, the leader of the Apaches, at the time when the buffalo disappeared because they'd been killed by the white men. And so Apache culture, and Indian culture in general, is all organized around buffaloes. It's about hunting buffaloes, it's about eating them, about using their coats, it's so on and so forth. It's about raiding parties on other people who've got buffalo, so on and so forth. So when the buffalo go, it's like what happens when those machines come and they take away all of those jobs. The material basis for the culture of the Apache disappears. It goes. In like 2 decades, the buffalo are there and then they're gone. How can you be an Indian with no buffalo? That's the problem that they faced. And so Sitting Bull's answer is there is only one way to be an Indian. It is with buffalo. We are Indian. We have to fight. And we have to fight the white people. And we have to defy them and take the struggle to them. And we have to go down being Indian. And even if we go down, we are still Apache. And so he ends up being assassinated by the US government. And the Apache end up somewhere else. This is Plenty-Coup. Plenty-Coup was the leader of the Crow. And Plenty-Coup faced the same challenge. How can you be a Crow when there are no buffalo? And what he said to the Crow was, I've had a dream that you can be Crow when there are no buffalo, but we have to journey together to find it. And I don't know where exactly this future will lie, but it lies in us exploring together what that means, and we must follow that kind of dream. It was like a kind of vision. And Plenty-Coup then led the Crow to a different kind of accommodation with modernity, which, of course, the Apache would say was a sellout and meant that they were no longer proper Indians. But Plenty-Coup would say allowed a sense of radical hope that you could reinvent your identity whilst also, in a sense, maintaining it. And I think our challenge, in a way, is do you want to be Sitting Bull or do you want to be Plenty-Coup? And neither is a very comfortable position to be in, but they're both trying to lead in a situation of this radical uncertainty and to generate a sense of hope. That is what I think we're at. And if I can find the time in the next year, what I most want to do is to write a kind of compendium of hope. I want to kind of just find all the stories around the place where there is a sense of hope and dynamism and creativity being generated. Because amidst all this mayhem, there is masses of that creativity, that source of energy. And one of the most important places it will come through is in cities like this. Thank you. That.
If nobody wants to shoot the first. Thank you very much. I think your position. Wow. Funciona o no? Okay, I think you've been brilliant. Well, you've been brilliant anyway. Just for you.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, the question is the following. You've been very optimistic about Barcelona, and of course we like hearing things like this. But my question is, why do you think that Barcelona is a model to any other city? Because our feeling is that the young people here feel, well, hopeless about their future. So why do you think Barcelona embraces those, what other cities would feel like their model?
Well, I may be optimistic about Barcelona because I'm out of date. But I would be optimistic about Barcelona because I think its cultural and intellectual resources are vast, really. Its ability to draw on its past, to rethink its future is greater than many cities, and that it retains, I mean, it's in the midst of these huge struggles, I would imagine, but what really impresses me about Barcelona is that it's a real city. It's not a tourist city. It's not Venice. It's not the centre, not yet, and it's not the centre of London. I mean, I think that the centre of London inside the Circle Line is basically Dubai, basically. It's become a sort of like a rather it's become almost like a fake place, almost. It's in danger of becoming that. And I think this sense of rootedness about Barcelona, this sort of rooted cosmopolitanism is very, very powerful. Now, what would you have to do in addition to that is that you would have to make Barcelona then also a place of rampant entrepreneurship and creativity and experimentation, where new things were being done and happening and new questions were being asked the whole time, to attract young people to it and to make them think that this is the place where they're going to create the future. That, I think, is part of that story, I guess. But I think you have huge assets and possibility.
Sí, moltes gràcies per la per la intervenció. Jo li volia preguntar si no creu que la creativitat, que vostè ha apuntat com una de les 6 possibles respostes a la crisi existencial, si la creativitat no té també una part d'escapisme, en el sentit de voler crear un joc nou en comptes de millorar el joc ja existent. Si no té també a veure amb enfadament, perquè és una mica enfadament amb el joc que ja coneixem, i si no té també una part de voler recuperar el control o de més control, perquè si creem una cosa nova, evidentment la controlem nosaltres, en comptes d'haver-nos d'adaptar a una cosa que ja existeix.
I think, yes. One of the, I think everything you said is very interesting. So one of the things that I would say is one of the dangers that we have in Britain, Brexit, is that we think, liberal elite London, that everyone else out there is kind of wrong and we're creative and they're angry. Actually, they're creative and we're angry in a way. And what I'm trying to get at is that in anger, in coping, in escape, there are elements of that you have to connect to build a political coalition and a story that brings people with you. And so I think there's a way that coping can lead to creativity. I think there's a way that escapism can lead to creativity. There's a way to mobilize anger to make it creative. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think you're absolutely right that there's this dilemma, isn't it? Maybe we could escape to this world of the digital, which is entirely new, and then it turns out the digital world is completely uncontrollable as well. And in cities, of course, as you see in this city, as in every city, actually that doesn't work because cities need to renew what they've got the whole time. They can't just escape into some new nirvana. So what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that you need this discussion within cities, this way of bringing people together, which is a very dynamic and kind of interconnected discussion. It's not fantastical or naive, I suppose. And the most important thing is it's got to be about life. It's got to be about families, housing, education, transport, public space. It's got to be about sort of really basic things, not about these things.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was very inspiring for me. One question, if you can elaborate on this changing of the rules of the game, which I think somehow, in my view, really captures some of the challenges that we face. Because if you play with the status quo, then things can just get out of control in a way that doesn't look pretty, as you were saying. And somehow being in Barcelona right now and in a city that is trying to propose change and kind of liberate the good potential of people, it feels lonely in this moment in Europe in particular. I mean, meaning, because of the wider changes around. But my question would be, where do you see the agency? Because one of the worries, and I mean, I think the first question was about young people don't see the future, right? Don't have hope. I have to say, lots of my co-national, I'm Italian. They come to Barcelona for looking for hopes and jobs. I mean, still Barcelona, I think it's very attractive to European talent, at least. In Italy, although it's a wonderful country, young people, like, even more, they're pushed abroad. But I think the sense of there is no agency, and I think very much connects to what you're talking about, the robotics, I mean, the robot economy, the Internet of Things, the artificial intelligence, I mean, this world where things happen, where the human also cannot be involved. So my question back to this changing the rule of the game, where do you think the agency lies? Because the world is fluid right now. So, I mean, I know that here we have like the kind of quadruple helix, and you see academia, the state, and the companies. But I think there is something else happening where the agency is not the one that we would usually feel it is.
Well, so I would say, it's a very good question. I would say that, let me divide it into two parts. One is, I think there's a sort of thinking part. It's how do you ask questions in new ways? And so the question of what's the future of good work, or what's the future of work, or how do you understand all of that? That's the sort of question that lots of people are asking in different ways, but you'd have to ask it in a much more direct way, and you'd have to involve many more people in it and many more perspectives to open it up, rather than the question which fundamentally, you know, a lot of people like me have been working with, which is how do you get more people into more jobs? That's a different question. And we've done that. In Britain, we've got lots of people into lots of jobs, but they're very poorly paid jobs, and they need welfare as a result. And so as a result, what's happened in the world that I've worked in is that people have pursued a certain sort of orthodoxy, and when it's run out, they've sort of carried on with it rather than saying, actually, it's not working. So having an honest discussion about what's not working, this isn't working. What do we do? Because people don't ask that question because they're frightened because they don't know the answer to it. So you've got to be able to ask frightening questions. So the role of universities in a city like this should be to help people to ask those questions. You know, if you've got people in universities asking fundamental questions, they should be a helping society to ask those questions. So that's the first thing. And then the agency thing is that I think the really striking thing, well, the first thing is, I think the agency comes often from outsiders. It often comes from people who don't belong to the mainstream. But the one thing that I would say is that you have to think about building coalitions, that all innovation, and particularly social innovation, depends on building coalitions. And the moment you say, these people aren't going to be part of our coalition, you've lost it. So I am really struck by the number of businesses that I talk to, mainstream businesses, who basically, if you get them sort of talking on their own, will say, actually, we've got no idea what our future is. You know, we don't know. So I gave, last night I was in a discussion, one example, which is terribly sort of trivial, but in a way, but very basic. There is a German boiler maker called Vaillant, and they are a brilliant German company. They make boilers for houses to heat hot water. There is nothing more important than a boiler, okay? So your boiler breaks down, that's more important than your Wi-Fi breaking down, probably. So these are important things, right? So they are I think the second largest boiler maker in the world. They make these white boxes. They're brilliant at it. They've invested hugely in energy and eco-efficient ways and making boilers. They're absolutely fantastic German company, all that engineering. And they came to me earlier this year and said, actually, we don't know what the future is of a boiler. And the reason we don't know the future of a boiler is because actually boilers are becoming computers, and they're becoming networked to systems. And actually, all the value is going to be up in these systems, and that's about software and communications and stuff like that. And the boiler is only going to be a small part of it. And so we think we need all sorts of new relationships, because there's going to be new rules of the game in the boiler business. And we don't know where. So what you've got to do is get defensive organizations into a conversation where they can admit that they too are facing these challenges. But it has to be on that basis of a sort of shared admission that no one really has the answer yet. And so then you have to work together. But that's quite a challenge. But I think you've got SEAT here in the subsequent discussion. So I did a thing for their ultimate owners a couple of years ago. And it was basically that the boiler is the car. which is, what's the future of the car? And there's a group of people in VW who think the future of the car is great because there are all these people all over the world wanting to buy cars because they've never owned a car. And a bunch of other people saying, but if you go to Berlin, young people are burning cars. And so in cities, there's no future for the car. And so the company is in a kind of state of civil war about what its own future is. And I think there are more organizations who are in that state of civil war. And you have to say to them, look, actually, there are lots of people tackling these uncertainties. Let's ask this question together. That might be the basis for a response. There's one more at the back.
Thank you very much for your talk. It has been inspiring, and I agree with most of what you said, or everything. We've had very recently, the few past days, a minister in Spain who has come out with this new idea of changing the working habits, the times, and all these. And then all the news from TV have been comparing us with other countries. For example, we take about 1 hour and a half or 2 hours for lunch, while in the States you take 15 minutes to eat some small thing, and in other countries you take half an hour. Okay, and they all said we work a lot of hours, but our productivity is below the average of other countries.
In Spain?
So, in Spain, yes, including Catalonia, I would say. And then we get these messages from governments, from these things, that we are worse than others, we are lazier than others. And they use these measures, which all of them are dominated by industrial economics rather than social well-being and all that. Could we also have some measures about social productivity or something like that, so that we can keep the good things of what we have, instead of having to have this sort of complex that we have to be more like Germans or maybe Swedish or something like that?
Why can't you be Catalans? I suppose is the question. So I'm a bit, I mean, Britain, similar issue, very low productivity and declining productivity growth, which I think a lot is to do with, partly to do with education, but is actually to do with the organisation of British business over a long period of time, so on and so forth. So the first thing that I would say, this is a bit naive, is hold on to lunch. I would really hold on to it, because I think that I mean, I know this is not going to be favoured by chief executives in the room and stuff like that, but actually most of the most important conversations you have about work and other things happen over lunch. And I would ban people, this is what I would do in Barcelona, you've banned Airbnb. I would ban people eating lunch at their desk, a sort of American habit. So we'd make sure that doesn't happen, because actually it's dreadful. So the first thing is that I would keep hold of that as an idea. Not rigidly, but as an idea. And the second thing is this point about what are we valuing. So if you want Barcelona to behave in a different way economically, and if you want Catalonia to do so, then you have to create your own measures of success. And you have to create really good measures with business and investors, which make sense, both of the financial and economic returns, but also the social and cultural and environmental returns. There are people all over the world working on that, trying, as there are with basic income and other things, to try and create new measures of sustainable adjusted value. I would do it, and do it with business, not against business, to try and work out what those numbers are, so that you can think, actually, this has a real value to us, has a cultural and economic and social value, this thing, that if you got rid of in the name of short-term quantitative productivity, you'd lose something very important. So it's important to be able to have that argument. So have it, Don't let it be the enemy of change, though. Don't let it be the enemy of innovation. Don't let it become simply a protectionism. Use it as a way to have a discussion about the new. Thank you.